Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. My name is Steve Kemish. I'm managing partner for an agency in the United Kingdom, and we're also a partner company with Datamatics Financial Services Limited, who are hosting this webinar for us today, and I've got the job and privilege of hosting you throughout. Now, what we're here to talk about is data and how we can use it to power lead generation and marketing performance. Before we start on that, a couple of slides just to introduce myself and Datamatics. Datamatics as an organization have been around for nearly 40 years, employ over 1,000 people across the globe and spend their time working on data-led strategies to help organizations like yours. And they've asked me to come along to share some of my experience of having worked in digital and data marketing for the last 2 decades from various organizations in the UK, but over in Europe and of course and across in North America too. So a range of organizations where I work in my day job, and also as a lecturer in digital and data-driven marketing, which I've done for about 10 years, and my experiences of that to help form this webinar for you today. Now, this webinar is part of the iData series of webinars that Datamatics are run, and hoping to just share best practice knowledge and experience with people like me to help everybody to improve or give some ideas on how to improve what they do with their marketing and lead generation. Okay, a couple of practical thoughts. Firstly, hopefully you can hear me, but I'm afraid I can't hear you. However, don't fear. If you do have any questions at any point, please do feel free to submit them via the questions module inside the application. That'll allow me to, at the end, dedicate some time for those. However, I'll try and dip into any questions I see submitted at any relevant or salient point throughout the presentation. We're recording this webinar as well, and we'll send you a follow-up link afterwards. So if you want to listen to it again, you want to share it with colleagues, please do. And back to those questions, the only rule I really ask is don't fear any question at all. As you type a question to that question module, if it seems like it's a bit of a stupid or a daft question, trust me, it won't be. The only questions, in my experience, are stupid or daft are the ones that you don't bother to ask. So please do ask a question, even if you're not sure quite how to express it. Between you and I, we'll work out a way to try and get some value from it. And don't also be afraid of selfish questions either. If you've got a question that you think nobody else in the room will be particularly interested in, don't worry, ask the question anyway. I'll get back to you one-to-one, or indeed you may find, as often we do, selfish questions that you might think are not relevant to others are often very inclusive. And many of us in marketing and communication have similar challenges, even if we work in different industries, in different territories, and in different ways. And we're lucky today to have a number of people from various countries around the world joining us, but hopefully we'll find that we're all in that same boat together. And that boat for this particular session is how can we use data in a more intelligent and informed way to help with our lead generation and our demand generation programs that help us ultimately, as a marketing function, deliver more commercial, sales-ready value to a business. Now, before we dive into that, just to set the scene on this particular webinar versus perhaps others or different disciplines of marketing and lead generation, what you're seeing on screen now is a very simple slide that's my view on how we should approach things. We would logically work left to right, starting with the who through to the how. However, where we find things go wrong for organizations is that they often tackle this the wrong way about. So they'll start with the how. They might have access or experience of certain channels of marketing, whether they're inbound, whether they're outbound, whether they're both, or perhaps newer, shinier disciplines such as marketing automation, programmatic advertising, all areas of communication and opportunity that are very powerful if used correctly, but really do rely on two dependencies, two fuels, if you like, that help power and make you decide who you should target via which means. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Is we're going to talk about the who, the starting point, understanding more about our prospects and our audience, and using data and some techniques around data and segmentation and insight to help us really get a better grip on how we prioritize the prospects that we're going to go for. After that, would then come things like messaging. So what's the content that we may create? How would we tell a story? And other disciplines that we may cover at another time around things such as behavioral economics or the emotion of decision making. Now, in business to business, it's not often talked about, the emotion of decision making. It's deemed inappropriate or unprofessional. But bear in mind mind that most humans make decisions in an irrational or an emotional way as well as rational. And therefore, it's an important thing to think about is if we understand our audience, who are they? What is it we want to say to them? And then, and only then, should we talk about the channels that we're going to use to get to them. So the marketing techniques, whether those are digital or traditional or both. So for today, we're looking at one of those two particular fuels, and that fuel is data. I'm sure you're all familiar with data. It runs a thread throughout everything we do, whether that's for marketing, for service, for whatever aspect of our roles. But let's spend today thinking about how we may try and improve the use of data and uncover some techniques that help us to enrich and add greater value to what we've got to hopefully make it easier or more effective with our lead generation. Now, if we look at research, this is research from CMO.com. It's global research that's asked B2B marketeers, actually, what is it that they think gives them the best quality of leads at the moment? So quality and quantity by channel. And none of those on that slide will be a surprise to you, I suspect. But what is important to remember, if we just prioritize even the top few, so email marketing, organic search, telemarketing, or cold calling, shows and events, third-party webinars, and we go down the list, every single one of those is underpinned by having good data. In simple terms, email marketing quite literally doesn't happen without somebody's email address, but even that isn't enough to be effective in sending a one-to-many message. We want to ensure that when we've got the basic data to communicate with people, via email in this instance, we then understand how we can collect other data, contact data against an individual, and or perhaps company data, or even industry data to help us understand better who they are, how they work, and then how we might then create our messages, whether those messages are delivered via email, maybe over the phone, the content that we create that draws people in for things like SEO, and the other different disciplines there. So however you look at data, it's going to be fundamental to whatever you do from a lead generation and marketing point of view. And there's always an opportunity to improve or to systemize how you work to ensure that we have regular intakes of good quality feed. What we're in essence trying to do is avoid this risk of guess who. We'll have databases holding information for us, but we don't want to be able to guess. We can't afford to guess in this day and age. We want to try and say, okay, what can we do to understand these people better? Are there characteristics? Of course, it's not possible for us all to try and stand up in front of these people face to face, but if we could, we'd instantly recognize them differently. In our diagram, in our illustration here from a kid's activity game called Guess Who, then you can see the differences, male, female, whether the hat wear is hair, etc., etc. Now, those aren't characteristics for us in B2B, but knowing the different look and the different details of an individual will help us get to a one-to-one or to segment them into relevant like groups rather than just trying to target everybody, or perhaps starting with a Mr. A through Mr. Z or Mr. Z strategy, which is really alphabetically correct but not particularly effective when it comes to trying to go through large prospect lists and get out leads and opportunity at the other end. So we see data in quite a binary way often. We hold that data in different forms, in different databases. That doesn't really matter for today, at least. It's about how do we actually turn those ones and zeros into something with a bit more color and a bit more substance. When also surveyed, a similar set of people also asked where the priorities are for them in marketing. And this will be people like you and I. What are we worrying about in the next financial year or next calendar year or both? Well, top of that list is often the pressure of converting contacts and leads into customers. And even before that is ensuring we've got as many prospects that we can turn into leads to allow our salespeople to then take leads to customers. So we're growing traffic is the second measure, which hopefully will become contacts. We've got existing customers, but we're also looking for prospects as well. So again, a number of different things that will be priorities for us all, but allow us to think about, okay, how do we stand out? How do we do less? How do we do more with less? How do we ensure that we target, prioritize accordingly? Well, back to our friends at Datamatics. This is a simple framework or model that they would work through that's a useful gauge for wherever you may be with data. So first and foremost, if you're looking to build a prospect file or enhance or increase a prospect file, you need to understand the needs. So what do you need? What kind of data do you need to be able to power your marketing channels? The temptation is for us to collect an awful lot of data on as many people as we can, and that's great where it's possible, but for some of us that may not be achievable in the first instance. So think about how you may prioritize and define what it is you're trying to capture and in what proportion and priority so that you can start the process. And remember, this is a process or a culture. It's rare to be able to do a data project and then expect never to do it again. Unfortunately, data goes out of date. People change jobs, people leave jobs, all sorts of reasons why data may not be still working months or even weeks down the line. So it's important to think about this on a regular basis. So once you've defined it, then we start to design the data capture. So there's two aspects to think about here. One, how do we capture it in a way that's validated? Simple measures that ensure that you've collected data that's usable. And I don't just mean the law, we'll come back to that, but I mean simple things like if you're using humans at events over the phone, however that may be, that they are thinking about how to best collect data so it's usable. Email records, for example, it's very important to get the syntax exactly right. Otherwise that email address won't work, it will simply bounce and be in a redundant record. And then how do we develop it? So how can you add something to it? If you've already got some contacts, but you've got missing fields, you don't know roles, you don't know regions or something about their company, size, turnover, location, anything like that, we can start to add that in as well. And then we can implement that procedure, look to understand how we optimize it, how we measure, and how we innovate. And as we'll talk about on a few slides' time, innovation is opportunity to look out the wider world of data and add in flavor and color that helps us look at organizations and individuals in a more dynamic way. And then, of course, there's the review. We want to understand that we've achieved the goals that we've set in the definition phase to understand where we go next. Is this, as I mentioned, a recurring project? Have we done a small piece to prioritize and then we need to look into other areas? Or is it something that we come back to at perhaps a quarterly, monthly, or annual basis? If we go a bit deeper into that, and I'll not cover all of this today, but just thinking about how we take the universe of data on stage one at the top there and use some of the tools, and these are Datamatics internal tools and processes, but the same could apply for you, or certainly as an intellectual starting point. We run quality checks, so validate email addresses. Now, validating email addresses is really important to do at the point of capture and collection, whether that's done via purchase of data or via telephony, so qualifying that data, which is a really essential thing to do with business to business. The other thing as a top tip that you really want to ensure you do at that point and as close to as you can is to send out some kind of email, either to opt them in where countries require opt-in or to try and get them engaged and active. There's lots of evidence to suggest that the gap between capturing an email address and using an email address, the longer it is, the more risk you have of them not remembering you or not being interested in hearing from you. I'll show you an example from a very lateral field a bit later on. Then we start to add some intelligence to it, and as we'll talk about again, so you might be interested in just contacts, but think also about the industry and how you might differentiate from one industry to another, how you might collect data that tells you one industry is more important, is larger, has more opportunity or appetite for your products or services. You can look at that from an industry, maybe a country level, even down to buyer demographics, as you can see at the bottom of the slide there, how people may well buy, and any insight that might help us to prioritize. And when we think about funnels and filters, where we're trying to drive prospects through to some kind of marketing qualified lead or opportunity, it will better help us prioritize where we spend our time and effort. Now, when it comes to data, a couple of headline areas to think about. Firstly, as I mentioned already, there's the legal side of it. So we need to ensure that wherever we're operating, we're inside the law. Unfortunately for us, business to business and business to consumer law, for that matter, varies from country to country. There's no one consistent rule. So if you are an international marketeer and you're operating in other markets, other countries, regions of the world, you need to understand, firstly, the legal issues. So if you are sending messaging from the United States into somewhere like Germany, it's the German law that applies to you, not the United States law. And unfortunately, or fortunately, if you look at it from a consumer point of view, but for us, some laws are stricter than others. So you need to ensure that you're not only just covering the legal base, but then also best practice. Just because you're inside the law doesn't mean it's correct or appropriate for them to hear from you by the channel or method you're using. So we try and find a balance between legality and ethics that ensure you get the best possible result. That often comes back to point 2, which is trust. Does the recipient trust you? Do they know who you are? Possibly not, because you're prospecting to them. So build trust in a way that says you are of value and of use and relevance to them, rather than trying to hit them too hard and just bomb them with content or messaging that may well just turn them off. Collecting data, first-party collection of data, is actually reasonably straightforward if you follow a very simple rule, which is the value exchange. So on point 3 there, if we look at things like email, people will give you an email address, but only if they realize and perceive the value of what they're going to get back from that email address being handed over is greater than that email. And that's the same for any data. People will give us data if they can see the purpose and what the value to them is, rather than the value to us. The temptation is always to collect lots of data to help us segment, but why would it be useful to them? So think about what you can offer and how you can signpost and prioritize those things to help them. And one of the key points for that is around registration, which we'll also talk about, which is point 4. A small international point to remember as well, safe harboring. Now this is the idea that if you are working or transferring your data from different systems in different parts of the world, there are different rules that apply. And a good, credible data organization will know these rules and hopefully also give reassurance, guidance, and will have presence in the countries that you're operating. So, for example, if you are trying to talk to the UK market, and maybe you're an organization in Germany, Canada, United States, wherever you are, remember that the UK law applies, not the country that you're in or that your organization's in. So work with a company that collects data inside the law in that country, and ideally with presence there, and also can guide you to understand what it is you're going to need to do to ensure that you can use that data ongoing. Now, I mentioned B2B and B2C are different. That's good, but for every country, there's a different law as well. The big one to think about here that you may be familiar with already is number 3, GDPR, stands for General Data Protection Regulation. This is an EU-wide law that comes in May 2018. Lots of press around it at the moment. It's quite a fundamental change that's designed in theory to level out the playing field and to ensure that data regulation and permission is the same across all EU states. Now, I'll show you a slide on that in a bit more detail. At the moment, each EU member state has a different law, as other countries around the world that have varying or very subtly different law. Remember what's ethical as well as legal, but also importantly as well, remember, as we go on to the next slide, the GDPR here, if you are outside of it, EU, but you're going to be sending messages to people inside the EU, some of us will know that because you'll be targeting certain countries, or maybe you're about to go into the EU because you're looking for a growth market, or maybe you've got data where you don't know its origin or you don't know which country they're in. All of those things are important and actually will be covered by this legislation. So some questions when you're working with an organization to help you with data collection. With the data you've already got or ongoing data collection, you'll need to have some kind of audit trail. So how and when was that consent obtained? What was the context for it? And what they're looking for with GDPR is to avoid ambiguous consent. The idea that you've just basically found somebody's business card on the street or at an event, or taking it from them in a way that means they weren't expecting to hear from you. A number of other questions that are there that are important to you. It's not just a case of ethics, and we don't want brand reputation where your organization is not associated with good practice, being useful, respectful, and helpful. But as you can see at the bottom of the slide, there's some fairly hefty fines that go alongside things. 20 million euros, which is roughly 20 million US dollars, very approximately, or 4% of your total worldwide annual turnover, which is the highest. And that can be considerable for us in any organization. So certainly is one we should be aware of and be prepared for in the future. So that value exchange that I mentioned, make sure you look to find a balance between you as the organization and the prospect that you're trying to capture data from. As a starting point for our communication, email or telephone is the most logical route to them. And if you look at some research from France a couple of years ago, it reckons that the average consumer, whether they're a professional or whether it's from a personal consumption, sees their email address as having roughly $5 approximately of value. Now, that's not to say that you and I need to send them a $5 note in the post, but we should think about how we may give them something derived value to that. And I'll give you some thoughts and ideas on how B2B organizations can do that. That doesn't mean you give real money away, but you give them some kind of value, some kind of content that is of equivalent value. As you can continue to do that, as you build a relationship with somebody, when you go past just collecting email address, etc., you really can start to build a long-term relationship. There are techniques and methods that we can talk about another time around surveying and polls and quizzes and all sorts of different techniques, as well as using data analytics, understanding what people are consuming to continue to collect data without spooking them or making them feel uncomfortable. Don't ask for too much too soon is my learning. And if you look at it in a slightly different way on this slide, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea at least of speed dating. The 3 minutes or so you're given to sit across from somebody in an environment, as we can see on that slide, where you may well try and romantically engage with them. But you're not going to ask them at the end of that 3 minutes whether they'll marry you. Far too much too soon. And that's exactly the same when it comes to data collection. Think about the data you need and what you really need. Don't ask for too much too soon, and it scares them off from even starting a relationship with you. If we translate that back into something like a registration page, what you're seeing on screen here is a really helpful, useful registration page for a company. It's a really helpful, useful resource for marketing law, but it's hidden behind this registration. This is a free resource, but to get to that, there's one hell of a commitment. You need to create a username, and coming up with a username in this day and age is difficult. I don't think it's necessarily required anymore. Why not just use an email address? Email addresses are unique, and therefore ask somebody to enter their email address. They'll know it, it's much easier for them, and they can move on. But look also at all the other mandatory fields denoted by that asterisk. Why do we want to collect that data at this point? Because it helps the organization that own the website, but does it make the person who's going to fill it out, who's never really engaged with this organization before, want to do so? Probably not. So think hard about the data you collect and the order you collect it in when you're collecting it first party, and third party as well for that matter. So, thoughts on how you can come up with a value exchange. You'll have content, you'll have insight, knowledge, in all sorts of formats that you, externally or internally, that you may be able to put to people at that point. In exchange for you giving us some data, we'll give you access to a report. We'll let you sign up to our newsletter where we have latest news and offers. Maybe you've got access to a premium area on your website, or maybe it's premium events, forums. They may be able to save time with what they do. There may be a save money. Now, the save money might be a direct bribery of £10, $10 off your next order, or free delivery. But for many of us on this call, that's not going to be appropriate for us. We probably sell products or services that are of a higher price than that, and we can't justify that level of expenditure. What else can we give them that's something for nothing? Maybe it's a competition, maybe it's access, maybe it's just giving their opinion. And people will want to tell you how they feel, not necessarily about you, as well as they might want to just share industry comment or observations. Find a mechanism to try and encourage them to give you data, and as I mentioned, they'll understand why they're giving it to you and what they'll do with it. Touch points that can also help you to collect data on and offline, depending on how you work. Remember, if you're doing advertising, pay-per-click, banner ads, all sorts of things like that, your landing pages, they'll have a primary purpose, which might be to get them to complete a form, to contact you. But look for a secondary option, which is slightly lighter sometimes. If not everybody's going to complete this task, can we at least get them to give us some small bit of data, an email address, for example, and then link it back to that previous slide, where we may try and encourage them to do that because they're going to see something of value for them or their organizations. Not all of these on this slide will be applicable to you all today. I don't think happy birthday, for example, for business to business is that applicable. It's a good technique for consumer marketeers. But anniversaries might be important. Really useful data for us is to know your prospect industry or company's financial years. When does their financial year start? When does it begin? That can give you a clue as to timing as to when you may talk to them. As you well know, sometimes at the end of a financial year, you may well have excess budget, or you may have zero budget, it's all gone, and therefore you need to wait for the end of the financial year and the start of the new one, or indeed you don't want to miss the opportunity that in that last quarter, that might be the time that they're going to buy from you because they don't use their budget, they're going to lose their budget. So try and look for insight like that. A, as touch points to go back to people, to remind them of you, but B, also to help continue to gather intelligence and data. I mentioned this earlier as an example. Now, this is not going to be applicable to many of us because we, I doubt, can give 20% off. But this is a welcome email. When you've collected somebody's email address for the first time, whether you're having that done for you by a reputable third-party data company, or people are coming to you on your website via an event, whatever it might be, try and set up some kind of real-time triggered message. As soon as they've been confirmed, send them something like this: a thanks for signing up, and here's an immediate thing you can do. Now, in this particular instance, for a retail brand, they've used 20% off any clothing because of the margins of their products. And look at the results. Huge increase in open and first day order by captivating them and acting on the interest that that particular person's shown. Again, we may be able to do this in B2B with different offers. Give them content, perhaps your most popular blog post, a white paper that you know is popular to people like them. Anything that gives them a reason to do something with you straight away means that when they next receive a communication from you, whether that's an email or a phone call or whatever the method may be, they're far more likely to engage with you at that point because they previously received and thought useful something you've sent to them. At the other end of the process, we will lose people from time to time. They may well unsubscribe from us. We need to be within the law to do this, so of course we must let people opt out whenever they want to leave us, but it doesn't have to be as binary as you're in or you're out. Many organizations do just stick at that point, but think about some of the examples on screen now. Perhaps it's the frequency of emails that's forced them to think about unsubscribing, and maybe they want to try different frequency. Maybe the emails that they're getting at the moment on a particular topic, area of your business or industry is not relevant to them anymore, but maybe there are other messages via email that you could still keep sending to them. Give them some permission centers or choice to decide on their subscription and how they manage it. And as the example that HubSpot has there on the left-hand side, they also recognize that if you are going to leave via email, maybe there are other channels that we can still communicate from. So perhaps if you're using social or other routes where that individual can still keep in touch with you, think about how you may use that too, rather than just losing them and not doing anything more. So, a couple of headline questions that you often get asked at this point. What do we do with our data? Do we build data? Do we buy data? The data market is awash with organizations willing to sell you data or to rent you data, and of course to build it as well. And a common question for organizations that we work with is, what do we do? Do we build it? Do we buy it? Do we do both? And often the answer is that last point, which is to build and buy. Why I say that for you is that really it's unlikely in this day and age that you're going to find a data list, a third-party list that you can buy that's going to give you all you need from a prospecting point of view. Firstly, from an accuracy point of view, how up to date is it? Data degrades quite quickly, and it's impossible for pretty much any data company to keep real-time up to speed, whether an email address still works, whether that person still is in that particular job, in that particular company. However, buying the base data can be a very helpful way to start to put foundations in place, but then you would look to enhance or to color that data by building on top of it, using telephony and other methods to employ people to help you collect data in an ethical and a legal way that ensures that you start to understand more about data. And of course, because it's been done very recently, you know and can trust the data is accurate and is up to date. But again, remember, that needs to probably be an ongoing process rather than a one-off exercise. Think about it as a regular piece of budgetary work that you look at, maybe quarterly, half-yearly, at least annually. And certainly if you're in an organization where you're looking at putting new systems in place, an email system, marketing automation system, any kind of technology like that, it's really important to budget and think about cleaning up your data before you put it in. And unfortunately, we see a lot of instances of organizations that put data into a marketing automation or email system and expect great results. And the technology may well offer lots of options. However, if you put bad data in, I'm afraid you're only going to get bad results out. So do think about that too. So the cleanse and enhance piece, which is what we're going to talk a bit more about, particularly on the enhance, the cleanse is quite simply to remove data that's not accurate anymore. And the enhance is not just replacing missing fields, but it's adding new fields, new insight that helps to give you a broader picture. Imagine this a bit like creating a jigsaw puzzle. Of course, when you start a jigsaw, there's many, many missing pieces. The more you put the pieces in, the more the picture becomes clear. And of course, the easier it is for you to put more relevant pieces alongside it because you've got a better understanding of where it all fits together. And that really is data, is understanding where there are gaps, how you fill them in, and how you get a better picture and a better view of that prospect audience that you're targeting. And really what that means for us is that we look at things differently. If you stay along enough of this picture, you'll see a different view. But don't worry about that. Just to make the point, well, okay, it may just look like a whole bunch of blocks and lines, and that's normally the case. Data can be a bit baffling to people. So at the basic level, we'll be familiar for sure with data like this that we're seeing on screen, simple information of one contact and how we could get in touch. But we've got no priority, we've got no ranking, we've got no color or insight that helps us inform quite who we'd start with and why. And therefore, we'd look at how we might segment data. How would we try and break it up into manageable chunks? On screen are the four main ways that you would classify data: by demographics, and for us with business to business, that will be things like industry, size, turnover; by preferences, what permissions and what requests have they made to us in terms of the routes that will send them communication: telephone, email, SMS, post, event, etc. Behavioral data, what do we know about them already from what they've consumed with us? Have they ever opened emails from us before, versus do they always open emails? When did we last talk to them? When did they last do anything? And then the last one, which is of great value, is the value. What have they bought from us in the past? Have they bought many things? Have they bought once? Have they never bought? Do they spend in a certain pattern or in a certain timing? Anything like that that helps to give us some way of talking to them. And of course, avoid some of the embarrassing incidents that you and I, I'm sure, are familiar with as consumers, which is you get offers from organizations for a product or service that you've already got at a better or keener rate. Not good for the merchant and not good for you from a consumer or relationship point of view. Now, if you look at those four together, there's some relative pros and cons, positives and negatives for us to think about. And I'll let you read that at a later date when you get a copy of this webinar. But if we go back to how iData and Datamatics work, this, although it's quite a detailed slide, takes you through a top left all the way to bottom right flow of something I mentioned earlier around the validation, putting in contact data. And then if we look and focus towards the bottom, what I'm interested in now is how do we enrich and enhance that data? So where can we go out to the wider world and look for information on third-party databases, so subscription databases, use social media, annual reports, industry reports, all sorts of other content that's out there that we can cleverly add in to give more of a picture. So instead of just having a database of contacts, we end up with not just contacts as we have on the left-hand side, but we can map it against things like market growth. So which of the sectors are these contacted in, and relatively, how well are those sectors doing? As you well know, for some of us on this call today, opportunities in growth markets where they're going fast, or maybe the opportunities with stable or more traditional markets. Think about how we might look at the risk score. So for that particular industry, is it a difficult industry to trade with? Is it stable? Is it at risk? You may overlay that with just sector as well as country, rather than just looking at one on their own. Some other areas we could look at: revenue. How much money do they make? And alongside that, how profitable are they? How fast are they growing? If you encounter two organizations on your database, both turning over $200 million, but one of them's taken 30 years to get there, the other one's done it in year 2, you've got a different view for their appetite in growth and how fast they may be going and their potential value to you. Employee count might be important to understand certain size of companies that you wish to go for. And our experience is actually revenue and employee count together are a good indication by industry as to how big somebody might be. But remember, sometimes industry by industry, we get very different employee counts compared to revenue. So consider high tech versus manufacturing or retail, where you may have 3 companies with the same turnover and a very different requirement in terms of number of employees. Other areas, how do they spend from a media point of view? Do they do capital expenditure? And what about their credit rating? That's very important for us to ensure that we don't expose ourselves to risk, that we sign somebody up to a long-term contract or agreement, and we can't see that they have got the right credit score for us to justify that. And then lastly, if we look a bit more broadly, understanding the company's, or the country's GDP. So that might help us to prioritize new areas, new territories to go into. Things like inflation, and if it's an international money exchange, how that could be good or bad for us or them if we're trading with different companies in different countries where they're buying in our currency regardless of what their currency may be. How easy is it to do business? How regulated? How governed is it? What about from a point of view of regulation, government effectiveness or intervention? All of these things can start to give us an ability to colour and prioritize who we target. So instead of having a chunk of thousands of prospects, we can start to break it down into hundreds of really good looking, relevant prospects that we should prioritize and try and target initially. Within the organizations that you target, it may also be when you're selling higher value, complexity, or price point services and products, that you've got different stakeholders in that business that will make a decision. So we don't, in this day and age, just want one contact on our database. And let's, for example, say that we're selling technology to a marketing department, something like an email system or marketing automation. Well, of course, the CMO is going to be highly likely to be involved in the decision making, but he or she won't do that alone. For something that's technology driven, IT, so the CIO or the IT director, it's going to cost money, so the finance director, the VP of finance, whatever it may be, will be involved. Maybe they're in an industry that's controlled by regulation. Well, there might be procurement, there might be a regulatory division, all sorts of different people that have a different take and a different appetite for information about your service or product. So we want them as prospects, and then what we want to recognize is how would we talk to them in a different way. And what you can see on screen here is some basic personas to look at people that buy, in this case, technology around governance and risk, but in a different way. So the enabler is somebody who has a different appetite and role to the risk governor compared to somebody who's there to do the independent assurance. So think also about how you may need multiple contacts to sell into an industry, even if actually they're not going to be the ultimate decision maker, they'll be part of the influence or the decision making unit. Also think about how we may color in data. So remember that people move jobs. The average B2B database will degrade by around about 25% each year. So 25 out of your 100 contacts will no longer be valid to you. And LinkedIn for you and I is a great route, and you can see my inbox personally here where I see some examples of people moving jobs, which is useful from a human-to-human point of view, but certainly from a lead generation point of view, when those are people that are customers or prospects, you want to be tracking these changes. These triggers might be important, positive or negative issues for you. People have moved jobs. Is that a risk? Is that an opportunity? Is it both? Think therefore about when you're notified or where we can collect data on change of job, change of address or location, or indeed the addition of a new office or branch or presence in a market or country, when they've had a promotion, the start and end of financial year, as I've mentioned, when there's a merger or an acquisition. So if a company that you're prospecting to has been bought or buys another company, what does that mean for us? Does it change the size and the opportunity with them? Many other different routes to go to that help us to try and find ways to get additional real-time information to help inform how we work with people. Now, in the social world, there's an infancy stage collection of data. So there's two organizations that I know of, Clear and Clout. And what we're seeing on the left-hand side there is my own Clout score, Clout spelt with a K. That's a 0 to 100 score that ranks how influential people are on certain topics. And as you can see, what it says is I'm 59 out of 100, so relatively influential, but not hugely so. But more importantly, it thinks that I tend to talk on and influence on the topics you can see on screen. So if you were interested in finding somebody who's interested in digital marketing, then it may well suggest on this data point I'm worth looking at and maybe building a relationship with. And maybe social is the right route to start, or at least is another additional route for you to monitor, to target, to try and engage and communicate with me. Now that works one-to-one when you know a particular prospect by their name, as you can see on screen. But on the right-hand side, if you're interested in a certain area, and this one that I've done a search for is for email marketing. So let's say you're an email marketing company, but you might as easily be selling any other service. You can search this whole spectrum of social profiles to say, essentially, tell me who's most influential on these particular topics, industries, products, services, whatever keywords you wish to put into the system. And that will bring back a set of search results for individuals and companies that are deemed influential. Now, some of those companies may be useful to us to directly target, but they may indirectly also be useful because they may have reach or audience that you don't yet have, and they give us a route to try and continue our message. That may drag some of those people back in to our content, which then allows us to try and do some of our own data collection. Now, as I said, it's in its infancy. It's not quite perfect, but it's something that's growing fast. So do look at how this kind of data may help to add additional insight as you build more and more prospect data over the coming months and years. If we look even further aside, there are many, many free and paid for, but I'm interested in this case with free tools that can help with even more enrichment of insight and understanding of people. Now, you may be wondering, some of you, why on earth I'd have a pair of what looks like jeans, but in fact something called jeggings, which are a combination of skin-tight leggings that look like jeans, simply jeggings, a fashion statement, if you will, a practical statement for others. Now, don't worry if you've never seen these before. I will bring it back to something relevant to B2B marketing. And if you search jeggings as a term on Google Trends, which is one of these many free insight tools, you can see two sets of search results on screen now. On the left-hand side is jeggings that's spelt with 3 Gs. Now, if you were ever asked the question, when were jeggings fashionable, this search result tells you that the peak of its searching was around about December 2010. So theoretically, jeggings were at their most fashionable according to historical Google searches around the world at that point. But you can see since then there's been a seasonal trend of more or less searches depending on the time of year. And you can also see where people are searching, the interest by region section, United Kingdom, United States, and so on. Now compare that to jeggings on the right, which is a very subtle difference. It's spelt with 2 Gs, not 3 Gs. Now that's not an incorrect spelling, but it does tell you pretty much the same traffic pattern. But look at the countries. Germany becomes top of the list. And therefore, tools like this can at a very micro or macro level, but in this instance, micro, say to us, if you're creating content, if you're using messaging over the phone, if you're written word, if you, for example, with a written word on a website or however you communicate, miss out a G in your spelling, you'll drive traffic and interest from Germany. If you want to capture that market, that's the way to spell things. If you're interested in other markets like the UK and the US, it needs to be with 3 Gs. Now, this is quite obvious to some of us that work in international, that will change the language of our content. But look for tools like this to help just give even further color or flavor to not only how the language might look, the trends also in terms of what's popular, what are people searching for, and where are they searching. Organizations that I've worked with have uncovered, using tools like this, markets or parts of the world that they didn't even appreciate people are interested in them or their products and services, and they've been able to look to target and increase their market in those areas by simply just tapping into where people are interested in them. So look wider at the different insight tools that are out there to help, again, with even further data. Once we've got this mixture of data together in this insight, as I mentioned, today is really about the collection and empowering of data. And maybe another time we can talk about communication strategy. But the example on screen is from a business-to-business organization that each of those yellow bubbles represents a contact point. Many of them are email, but some of them are printed, or so via post. But based on where somebody is in the journey, from suspect all the way through to a customer, all the way through to a high-value customer, or perhaps the lapsed, these are points that they know work well to try and contact them. But they're only run by data. So they've established and matured this over time, although it moves, because it's an evolution rather than a revolution that says, okay, depending on where somebody is in our journey, we will send them a slightly different message at slightly different points. So this is something that allows us to give us some kind of life cycle marketing opportunity driven by data. If we look at a case study on this to just try and bring it together now in the last few slides, well, an anonymized one but from the US, and it doesn't matter that this is from the US, this could be any company in any part of the world, but they were looking to go into new markets, into LATAM, so Latin American markets, and generate leads and opportunity. They sell cloud-based storage, and their target are directors of VPs of IT, so technical decision makers. We talked about the define stage early on in this presentation. What is it you're trying to do? Who do you want to target? All of those who, why, when, what questions that are really important. Then some actual goals so that we can assess and understand the value in return. Then when we look at the solution, the important point for this slide is that we initially build and validate 30,000 contacts. So we have a prospect pool quite quickly. We know it's going to be related to those decision makers in that particular area of interest, but we can't probably go through 30,000 contacts and nurture or try and generate leads from all of them. So how do we find some kind of priority? Well, that's where we use that data enrichment or enhancement. How can we take the 30,000 and turn it into our top 10? So using different data fields, third party and first party, we could turn those 30,000 into a top 10 or top 10%, 3,000 leads. Those leads was then a manageable enough size that could be communicated to via voice. So using qualified telemarketing techniques to try and turn those into real opportunity. So from 30,000, we managed to get to 3,000 using data enrichment and enhancement. And then through telephony, you can turn that into 300 highly probable leads. So talking to them and understanding and qualifying them to be interested. Then we calibrate that to the targeted top 5 industries, so it can help to prioritize even further. And then from a measurement point of view and ongoing comms, can start to not only identify and innovate, where are there other industries or territories we haven't thought of, but how do we turn those 300 into probable leads? So pass those over to the sales team at the right time, because as you can see from the outcomes of the 30,000 contacts, 300 leads turned into 175 meetings and 80 proposals. 33 contracts were signed within 2 quarters. So we can actually track all the way through from effort to return on investment, some numbers, just from those 300. But of course, remember, outside those 300, the 2,700 identified leads that we can continue to work, that we'd expect to get opportunity from later quarters. And then there's the 27,000 contacts beyond that may not be quite at any point more than suspect level, but we can start to send basic communication to begin the journey. And if we use lead scoring methodology here, we can start to rank and move people along our process. Maybe you call it a funnel or a waterfall or whatever your lead and sales cycle process may be, that we can start to continue to move people through at the right quality and quantity at every stage. Now, a couple of last points just before I leave you. Again, where data can be slightly lateral. If we are trying to prospect to people, we've got a database. When is best to communicate? What's about timeliness? Now, this insight is for a financial industry. However, this, in my experience, is very applicable to many industries that are on this call today. And what it recognizes from their research is that they targeted different emails at different days of the week. And Sunday and Saturday, for me, I don't think there's enough data to be statistically valid. But let's just look Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And what's interesting is they got the best effective results when you measure open and click on a Monday. Now, quite often, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is when most communication happens, the middle of the week. Mondays are deemed inappropriate because it's too early in the week. Friday because it's too close to the weekend. But this insight suggests that Monday is a very good time to talk to this particular audience. Now, that probably is a mixture of things. One of them, at least, will be many companies don't send emails on a Monday because of the fear that everybody else says Tuesday to Thursday is the best route. So use your own data, whether that's your analytics, whether it's third-party data capture from qualifying, from cleansing, from communicating with people, maybe your customer service, your sales team, if they take inbound phone calls, will tell you when's busier times than others. Anything that gives you a starting point to try and ensure that you've got the best time to try and communicate. And there may not all be days of the week. That might also be days of the month. That might be months of the year. It might be weeks of the year. Many other different patterns, depending on how long your sales process is, that just give you a view on when's best to talk to somebody. And remember things like that financial year. What quarter are they in? When's their financial year ending? That might encourage you. Perhaps also a really valuable reference point is, do they have an incumbent supplier? So do they already have a relationship with competition that they're in a contract with? And when does that contract end? Knowing when something's up for renewal is really important for us to make sure we time our communications effectively. Remember also, as a last point, where we are. So with the website in the middle of this quite busy diagram, that may be ultimately what we're trying to help with lead generation. So in this day and age, where we can phone people and qualify them to a meeting or opportunity, great, but often you'll need to knock at the door a few times. And a website's a great way for you to carry on a conversation or a relationship via telephone and digital, and get people to consume more content before they do commit to some kind of appointment, some kind of opportunity that a salesperson may follow up. But remember, we've got lots of different routes into them, and all of these different routes have different value depending on where somebody is. but they give you different fuel opportunities. So think about how your data may drive some of this. So the content you create, if you're using paid search, if you're using social, all those different routes to get to the website will be optimized by using data to continue to recognize who people are directly as prospects, where are their indirect prospects, those influencers that we looked at earlier, and where are there other opportunities, people that we hadn't yet considered, perhaps in markets, sectors, countries, regions of the world that we didn't realize were showing an interest in what we do or what our market does that may open up new opportunity. Okay, so officially the last slide of this particular deck, but I'm going to take questions now, and I can see a few questions. So do type any out that you've got, and I'll try and answer as many as I can on the time we've got remaining. Remember also, we've recorded this webinar, and we'll send you a follow-up link soon so you can listen to this again. We're also going to be sending out a white paper very soon that I've worked on as a follow-up to this particular topic, so hopefully it gives you some more depth and some reading rather than just some listening via the webinar. And again, more broadly, this is part of the iData series of webinars by Datamatics. The next one will be coming along soon, but if you've got any topics or areas that you'd really be interested in, please by all means get in touch with marketing@dfssl.com, which is Datamatics Financial Services. That may be around this particular case, it may be about other topics, or more broadly you may just have some interest related to what's been talked about today. By all means do get in touch with them. Now, as I promised, a couple of questions before we end, and let me just pick through a few. I can see a question here from Doug around about where do we start from a point of view of build versus buy. We've got some data, but how do we understand its origin and how we may want to increase or how we may wish to increase or to enhance that data. Okay, so quite a common question, Doug. We've got something, we've got some data, and where did it come from? Data can sometimes just turn up in organizations, and with things like GDPR, we must be aware of the fact that that may well put us under more scrutiny to ensure it's got the right permission attached to it. So always be wary of data you can't find an origin for, unless you are in a market where it's opt-out, and in B2B opt-out law means you can communicate relevant messages to people as long as you always allow them to unsubscribe from you, something like that. The enhanced bit, look at the priority, so do that scoping, ask the who, why, what, where questions initially. What is it we're trying to do? How complex is our proposition, our product or services? So if it's something that sells off a page, it's a lower cost, you may well need as little or relatively less data than you would if you've got a very complicated, high price service that might take many months or even years to sell. You want to know a lot more about people, and you may also need multiple contacts in multiple functions or departments, as I described earlier with those personas, the finance director, the IT director, the marketing director, etc., to try and color. So look to how you can prioritize rather than going for everything. Okay, one more question. Paula asks, from a point of view of going into new markets, where would we start? Limited budget, limited time, where's the quick wins? Okay, good question, practically. Why would we want to go into, we can't do everything for everybody. So remember that case study we saw earlier that said, okay, instead of looking at 30,000 prospects, look at them as to how you might prioritize them. So try and do some quick exercises to build the basic data that allows you to get going from a communication point of view, whether that communication is online, is over the phone, is postal, however that may be. And then look to use a bit deeper, and telemarketing, tele-surveying is a good route to do this, to turn that 30,000 into better sized chunk of prospects. Okay, so build your initial prospect pool. If you've got no real insight because you've not sold into a market before, keep it quite wide to start with. Then look to add in, enrich and enhance with insight data that says this industry is bigger, this is its market size, here are some patterns or behaviors that help you encourage certain industries to work faster. And then within that, apply the telephony to try and get it down to a manageable chunk. And look for quick wins, quick returns. So if you're doing something, it always helps to build confidence by getting some results, some leads, some sales on the board early. Not only does that stress test the process is working, but it also gives confidence and frankly money in the bank because you're selling things to justify doing more. So try and make it into manageable chunks. And remember, this is a program or a culture rather than it being a one-off exercise. Data does go out of date, so you'll need to have regular patterns and regular effort to continue. Okay, now that's all the time we've got questions for today, but thank you so much for joining us. As I mentioned, any further questions, please reach out to myself or drop marketing@dfssl.com an email with anything on today, any future topics. And on those future topics, I'm sure we will hear from you soon, and you'll hear from us certainly with any suggestions on things that we may be able to offer to you in later series of webinars. Thanks again for your time. I do hope you find it valuable, and I do hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you.